Get it going.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to session 47 of Examine Lives. Is that right, Sage? I think, or thereabouts.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
our topic today is loneliness, and as per usual, I'm gonna do about five to 8 minutes of introduction, and then I have a question that we could kick off our discussion with. So to begin, it's important to keep in mind that loneliness and isolation are different. Social isolation is objectively having few social relationships, roles, group memberships, and infrequent social interaction. In contrast, loneliness is perceived social isolation. How lonely you feel is determined by the gap between the amount of social connection you desire and the amount you perceive yourself as having. And people differ on how much social connection they want. If you take two people with the same amount of social connection, one may feel lonely and one may not because their desired amounts are different. In other words, sensitivity to social isolation, like most personality traits, lies on a bell curve. Interestingly, there is some evidence that people who are similar on the trait of loneliness tend to mate with each other. So in any given population, you have people who are high, medium, and low on susceptibility to loneliness. This actually benefits the population as a whole. You want folks who are low on susceptibility to loneliness because those are your explorers and solitary adventurers who go off by themselves and discover new things, whether that's in the jungle or in the lab. But you also want people high on susceptibility to loneliness because those are the folks that stay put and work hard on group connection and cohesiveness. So, what exactly does it mean to say someone is lonelier than someone else? First, loneliness, like most emotions, like all emotions, can vary in frequency, intensity, and duration. So, lonelier people experience the emotion more often to a higher degree, and it lasts longer. Second, there are three different types of loneliness that are discussed in the literature, and it can be helpful to specify which one you are referring to when you say that you are lonely or someone you know is lonely. The first is emotional loneliness, and that is having less intimate connection than you desire. The second is social loneliness, and that's having less connection with family and friends than you desire. And that is, research shows, is higher in women than men. The third is collective loneliness, and that's having less connection with a group or social entity that's beyond the level of an individual connection. And collective loneliness is higher in men than women. And people are more likely to act for the common good when they feel connected to their group. So we can right away see some adaptive value to connected collective loneliness. Note that so far I've been talking about the quantity of social connection. However, research shows that quality is more important than quantity. A few close connections is generally more effective at preventing loneliness than dozens of superficial relationships. So to wrap up, let me briefly talk about nature and nurture as they relate to loneliness. How did loneliness evolve, and what role does culture play? Psychologist John Casipio views loneliness as a psychological adaptation shaped by natural selection. Just as hunger makes you seek food, loneliness makes you seek connection. Seeking connection increases fitness, that is, survival and reproduction. He notes that for a social species, quote, life on the social perimeter is aversive and unsafe. Loneliness, he says, is like an alarm bell. It's a distressing state which signals that your social connections are insufficient in some way, perhaps dangerously so. And it motivates you to repair, replace, or expand them. And all of us are descended from early hominids who had this alarm bell of loneliness, because they survived better than the hominids who did not. Casipio's research finds, and I think this is interesting, that in addition to increasing motivation to reconnect, loneliness increases a focus on self-preservation and on threat surveillance. That is, it creates an attentional bias towards negative social stimuli. Ironically, self-absorption and hypervigilance are not very attractive personal qualities. So there may be, in fact, research shows lonely people are viewed more negatively. So there may be a vicious circle set up which can make it difficult for lonely people to improve their social connections. Lastly, turning to the role of culture and learning, one of the papers that was put out as a resource for today was a study by Barreto and et al. And it was an article on age, gender, and cultural differences in loneliness. They looked at 46,000 subjects across 237 countries. And what did they find? In a nutshell, they found that loneliness decreased with age, was greater in men than in women, and higher in individualistic cultures, especially for men and younger people. Overall, the subgroup most vulnerable to loneliness are young men living in highly individualistic cultures. Cross-culturally, one thing that is in common is that adolescents and young adults are especially prone to loneliness. And I think it's easy to see why that might be so. Teenagers are trying to individuate, and young adults are trying to emancipate from their families of origin. And that journey, both psychologically and geographically, often means that social connections are unstable and rapidly shifting. Barreto et al. Point out that there are complex interactions between age, gender, and culture. For example, collectivist cultures generally do a better job of taking care of their elderly. So the elderly in individualistic cultures, like ours, tend to be lonelier than the elderly in collectivist cultures. Another example is that women report more loneliness than men, irrespective of age, but men are more reluctant to admit feeling lonely, and even more importantly, perhaps, much less likely to take corrective action if they feel lonely. To conclude, the U.S. Surgeon General report on loneliness and isolation asserts that loneliness is a public health crisis in America at this time. The report presents data showing that loneliness has increased markedly in the past 20 years, is widespread, and has significant mortality effects and harmful consequences to our society. Interestingly, Casipo points out that the mortality effects of loneliness are mostly a result of our longer lifespans. So physiological effects of loneliness like hypertension and dementia only became deleterious in modern times because we now live long enough to experience them. He says, quote, "For most of human history, people did not live long enough for the harms to be of much consequence for the individual or the population." So here's my question to kick off the discussion. I think it's a safe bet, and you're free to disagree with me about this, but I think it's a safe bet that our hunter-gatherer ancestors experienced much less loneliness than we do. If so, then perhaps the higher incidence of loneliness in the modern era is a result of evolutionary mismatch. The Surgeon General's report documents a sharp increase in loneliness in just the past 20 years. Why do you think that happened, and what should we do about it? And with that, I'll kick it open for discussion and do my best to manage the queue. Diane, I see her hand is up, and you're muted.
So let me unmute. Um, I think it might be helpful at the beginning to distinguish between what psychologists like to call state and trait, because some of the remarks you made are about who, as a personality, is lonely. And most of them, I think, are about the state of loneliness.
Mhm.
And of course, that can differ according to demographics or culture or other kinds of things, but perhaps trait could also. But so are we really interested in the state, or are we really interested in loneliness as a personality type?
That's an excellent point. And of course, the two are related in the following way, is that if you have the trait of proclivity to loneliness, if we want to call it that, the same state is more likely to make you lonely than if you're lower in the trait. So there's an interaction between trait and state as well. But that's a really excellent observation, Diane. Andy.
Um, yeah, I never really thought much about loneliness before this, but I've experienced it, but haven't thought much about it. The story you told about loneliness's evolutionary function, Steve, and it seems plausible to me, is that sort of dangerous aloneness might have triggered this alarm, which is the feeling of loneliness, which would then trigger connection-seeking behavior, or which could then alleviate the dangerous aloneness and prove adaptive. If loneliness has spiked in recent years, I wonder if that feedback regulation mechanism hasn't been disrupted in some ways by smartphones and social media. So what if you get the illusion of connection inside? What if spending time on screens gives you the illusion of connection so that you stop seeking real face-to-face connection? And the whole feedback mechanism doesn't work to
That sounds that sounds plausible. And of course, it's the central idea behind Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, which is largely about loneliness in adolescence, particularly middle school agers, which he attributes precisely to use your word, Andy, the sort of illusion of connectedness that you get via social media. So yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, correlation doesn't mean causation, as we all know, but if loneliness has increased markedly in the last 20 years, that does parallel these technological changes. Kathleen.
I was going to mention John's book too. John was talking about it with someone, and they showed a video of a child less than 2 years old. They had taken away his phone. Why he had a smartphone, I don't know. But the child was screaming and wailing, and with his hand swiping. And it just showed how his whole neurophysiological system was craving the stimulus of that phone and not other people.
Mhm. Yeah, it is hard to picture a 2-year-old with a phone, but
And
seen it.
and you
Diane,
wonder
go ahead.
whether it hadn't, excuse me, but I couldn't help myself. You wonder what kind of personal connections that child has, that he's that
I,
dependent on a phone already.
yeah, I worry about his connection to his parents, but never mind
Yes.
anyone else. But here, entertain yourself with this device because I'm busy.
I mean, it horrified me because I have at times felt myself falling into that trap. Like suddenly, why am I opening this device again? And catching myself. So,
But I wonder if you would have reacted differently if it were simply a cherished toy that were taken from his hands. I mean, perhaps it has nothing to do with the social implications of a phone.
That's excellent point, Ken. Yeah, Rob's hand is up.
I'm just remembering that when we were in graduate school, my wife was a psychology student and told me about a kid who, when asked by the therapist who his best friend was, said the television.
Mhm.
It's not new.
Yeah. Well, that just to strike a note in the other direction of how media can possibly offset loneliness when we're thinking about children and television. For some reason, Mr. Rogers popped into my mind. And Mr. Rogers' target audience was 3-year-olds, give or take, preschoolers. And I think he was not a negative effect on children when they watched him. But at any rate, other thoughts about the epidemic of loneliness over the last 20 years and what causes it and what should we do about it. I don't think we're going to get the world to put down their cell phones, unfortunately. Hank?
Yeah, I want to move it away from the epidemic part to introduce a concept that can be looked at individually and collectively, a term that maybe some are familiar with, not or not, but the term self-alienation.
Mm-hmm.
And, I come at it from let's call it a existential humanistic psychodynamic perspective. But the people who've been addressing it associate self-alienation with shame. So what's self-alienation? When it's not a trait per se, like Diane was saying, but it could be viewed as a response to the absence of, let's call it mirroring or recognition of our essence, of our positive qualities, about our sense of competence, our sense of effectiveness. Results on a collective and individual level is a person that's removed from, let's call it, their constructive, positive quality. And then that leads them to trying to escape from it because it feels so shameful. So I want to at least add that the whole notion of self-alienation, which doesn't really come up as far as I've seen in the evolutionary biology, it takes place on an individual, one-to-one, family, and of course, cultural level. So how does our tribe foster self-alienation? Let's say my tribe doesn't like bald guys. Okay, I am fucked because I'm not going to be accepted for a bald guy. So I'm going to try, like some people, make believe I'm not bald, so I'll get a wig.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'll think of myself as somebody unappealing because my tribe only values hirsute people. So
Well,
I think
you're raising
Yeah.
an interesting point. I think the relationship between self-alienation and feeling alienated from others. I sort of see them as sort of like a yin and yang that mutually influence each other.
Yeah,
In
but
some
I,
way.
I
But
think, yes, that's definitely, but the self-alienation is what I believe gets overlooked. Of course, it has a social context, but it becomes an internal construct where you're alienated from your inner workings and what's constructive or positive about you, which is
I
different
guess
than
it makes sense. It would be hard to feel if I'm alienated from myself, it's going to be difficult to feel connected to other people.
Yeah,
Certainly.
because what you do is you get alienated from the desire for social connection. That's the
Okay.
bottom line.
Or
Okay.
perhaps you feel you're undeserving of it.
Yeah, that's the sort of the
Shameful.
surfacey part. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Andy, thanks, Hank.
Just a
Yeah.
question, Steve. I'm not sure I really have the concept of collective loneliness down. I was hoping you could elaborate a bit on your
Right.
understanding of what that's supposed to mean.
Yeah, my understanding of that is that the first two forms of loneliness, emotional loneliness and social loneliness, both have to do with one-to-one connections. So emotional loneliness is about your most intimate relationship. So you may think of that in terms of your romantic partner. That's intimate connection. So if you don't have that in your life, you might feel quite emotionally lonely. Social loneliness is still one-to-one, but instead of a romantic partner, It's going to be your sister, your father, your mother, your friends. It's still one-to-one. I don't have enough friends. Collective loneliness, I think maybe is kind of close to what Hank is talking about in terms of feeling alienated from the larger group. I'm not part of. I might have a relationship with my brother, but I'm not part of any larger group,
So,
and there's some collective.
suffering from a lack of belonging, or so
Mm.
collective loneliness would be feeling like you don't belong.
Yes, to you might feel like you belong to your family, but you don't feel like you belong. At least that's my understanding, of it as I read the literature. Kathleen.
Yeah, that reminds me when I had some French friends who told me they were lonely, and they were two couples, right? So, but they found that they would invite people over and then never hear from them again, and it made me think that it takes effort to cultivate relationships, and I think
Mhm.
people they see there's the fun part, but they don't see the effort part. Um, and there's a lot now that there's social media, you have to overcome a certain threshold of boredom in a way, if you're hooked onto social media, because social media is going to be constantly stimulating you and giving you information, and real people, it's a different kind, I think, of preferable kind of stimulation. But the effort part, I think, is missing from American life anyway, and maybe in other cultures, fewer people are making the effort too. It seems to be a
You,
worldwide epidemic.
I think you've hit on a really important part. I sometimes have used the metaphor of friendships are like a garden. You have to tend to it. You have to go out and weed it and water it and maybe do some other things. And if you don't tend to your garden, what happens? It goes to seed. And yeah, so I think that's a very important part. And you may be right too in that to the degree that social media friendships don't take a lot of effort, maybe the reward is commensurate with the amount of effort you put in, and which is not a lot on social media. Um, Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet? I want to make sure we have some newcomers. Crystal, I don't know if I've seen you here before, but welcome. Um, but people who haven't chimed in yet, I'd like to try to get as many. Oh, David Farrell, there you go. Thank you.
Hi.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
David.
thank you. Thank you. This is really interesting. I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm always interested looking at things, something like this as an adaptation. I just like to maybe have a closer look at what you said at the outset, that loneliness, that it is an adaptation, first of all, and then it makes you seek connection. So, for example, I can see a mismatch hypothesis based on group size and hunter gatherer compared to now, or the nature of those groups. And I think that's what a lot of people are speaking to. It's either the group is virtual, which is very different now, or it's so big, or it's not the same group consistently you're seeing day in, day out, and they know you by name and in deeper ways. And so that maybe in the past, loneliness, it's sort of a spectrum of how intense or frequent you feel it. It's very, very mildly lonely, and you're brought back into the fray, back into the group. I just want to see if this is other people's understanding as well, maybe in hunter-gatherer times, and that sort of is taken care of really quickly, whereas it has a tendency to get more out of control in an evolutionary mismatch situation in modern times. So I don't know if that's how other people are viewing it. And then secondly, just like to just challenge, I'm not saying it's untrue, but does loneliness actually make you seek connection? Because at least in modern world that I know, I've never been clinically depressed, but I have psychology, family, and friends. We talk about things, and I've been lonely myself. And of course, depression and loneliness, we don't know the correlation, the causation in different individuals. But I don't think it's necessary often, at least some depressed individuals do not seek.
Well, social isolation,
Right.
social isolation is a core symptom of depression.
Exactly.
But
So
in
yeah.
treating depression, one of the
Right.
things we're trying to do is reduce social isolation. So
Yeah.
I think it's recognized as a cause. One comment
Right. But like, does a lonely
hunter-gatherer.
person actually seek connection? I don't know if that's
Yeah.
actually You know, I
If
don't.
if they don't,
That is true.
they'll be depressed for sure.
Okay.
But one comment about hunter-gatherers that I think popped into my head as I was listening to you is just to not overly romanticize the life of hunter-gatherers. Some of you may know the phrase from the evolutionary psychology and anthropology literature, the tyranny of the cousins. So in small hunter-gatherer groups, you didn't encounter a lot of strangers, and you probably, for the most part, were less lonely, but you were also less free, probably, to be an individual.
Mhm.
It's strictly controlled, high demands to adhere to the group's norms compared to larger societies. But that's a separate topic. We could do a whole session on the tyranny of the cousins as
Mhm.
they call it.
Or on the idealization of hunter-gatherers.
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. I think you're right, Kathleen. That would be an interesting topic. Yes. Hank, you've had your hand up, patiently waiting.
Yeah, I want to respond
And you're
to.
not lonely because you've got a adorable
That's why I brought her here.
puppy with you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she was looking at me. Um, this is a response to Andy's question and Stephen, your response to it. The way I've begun to view collectivity, and humans in a collective, it's gotten clearer to me when you think about when I did the work on empathy. I did a lot of research, and the basic components of empathy are mimicking, imitation, and contagion. Okay, so just think of loneliness. It's a little bit of what Andy you've written about, but it's like a virus. So you hang around in a group. Let's say the MAGA movement, which I'm not particularly interested in, but it is a movement and it's something to deal with. But you get a lot of lonely people, or they're unhappy, whatever the mythology is, and you got to have. So you get together to, find a mission, a goal, a purpose, and you got to demean others to get what you want, so you can feel better and get what you want. But what's contagious is the loneliness or the alienation that happens without awareness. That happens. What's that called? The It's a neurobiology term. The mutual, non-conscious regulation of mood, affect, belief system, experience at the most primitive level.
Is that
So
synchronization?
yeah, but at the most primitive level, without cognition, before cognition ever enters. And then it gets rationalized by a particular movement, whether it's a religious movement or a theoretical movement. So I think it's important to keep in mind that contagion, the imitation, and the mimicry
Yeah.
shapes us all as part of evolution.
By the way, we did do an Examine Lives session on synchronicity. And so if you go to the video archives, you can watch that back. It was a few months back, but it was an interesting discussion. Ken, Dave, and Andy.
Okay, briefly, I just wanted to leap back to when we were talking about children, and reference another book by Jonathan Haidt called The Coddling of the American Mind, written with Greg Lukianoff, in which he says that in the last 20 years, American children have been isolated. They have not been allowed to develop the kind of peer relationships that they need to when they get older. They've just for beliefs of yes, there are pedophiles out there. There's danger, but it's over that people have been kept from having peer relationships. They've only allowed to have association with their peers when it was supervised by adults, or not had it at all. It's certainly a type of helicopter parenting, and that I suspect.
Free range children are an endangered species.
Yeah, I was just about to say that obviously the lesson for the way to solve that problem, and I'm definitely showing my age now, is a remake of that old television program, Our Gang Comedy. Those were kids that really had some good peer relationships and some great interpersonal skills. They
Right.
weren't depressed later in life. And the other point I wanted to make, just unrelated, unless anybody wants to respond to what I just said. Apparently not. Okay. And that's that a lot of these studies I see that say, well, in the last 20 years, we had this kind of last kind of depression. They've shown it spiking in 2020 with the with COVID, but then they don't show anything after that. So one doesn't know if how much it recovered. There isn't a lot of good information. In other words, there's been a tremendous effect on that. That's been skewed dramatically by COVID, and I don't think that information has been properly included.
That's true. The Surgeon General's report came out in 2023, which probably means they started gathering data and working on it pre-COVID. You don't get a sense in looking at that Surgeon General's report. There's not a lot of discussion in it about the pandemic. So it goes without saying, I think, that loneliness increased during the pandemic, particularly during the lockdown. An interesting question is to what degree has it rebounded back to its pre-COVID levels? I think we have David and then Andy, unless I'm forgetting somebody in the queue. Remind me. David? You're muted, Dave. No, you're not muted. But I don't hear you. We'll come back to you if you solve your mic problem. Andy?
Steve, you mentioned Fred Rogers a little while back. I'm actually sitting just a few blocks away from where Fred Rogers lives, which means I'm literally in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood as we speak.
Where's your cardigan sweater?
Yeah, over there in the closet in the corner.
Is that Martha's Vineyard?
Pittsburgh.
No, Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, PA. I've recently read a book about sort of the genius of Fred Rogers, and it actually makes a remarkable case that Fred Rogers, in addition to being pretty close to a secular saint, that he also had deep understanding of the psychological needs of children and was actually providing something that many kids needed as television was starting to consume more and more human attention and drawing it away from, among other things, children. And if you remember Fred Rogers' style, it almost felt like he was talking directly to you, right? Very slow, very patient, it delivered a kind of, I'm attending to you. It was the kind of high quality attention that I think many of us crave, and that experiments have shown, kids especially need. As more and more screen times pull our attention more and more ways, I wonder Fred Rogers utilized an information technology, television, to reach lots of children, but he may also have been just mitigating a problem that television was causing. And now, of course, we have many more screens of many more kinds, and the problem's getting worse.
Yeah, he was, I believe, an ordained minister and considered his television show his ministry. And as I said before, his target audience was 3-year-olds. And one of the reasons for the way he spoke quietly and softly and gently is that he, in his mind, was talking to a 3-year-old child. And that's the way, if you don't want to scare a 3-year-old child, you don't use your big, loud, booming adult voice. You talk softly and gently. And his main message was, to go back to Hank's comment about mirroring, I think a lot of what Mr. Rogers did was say to children, I see you, and you're okay, which is using television to offset maybe the downsides of television. So TV is like anything, it's like a tool you can use.
Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood on television in his gorilla cage at some zoo for weeks. And eventually Fred Rogers got to meet him. And the gorilla sat down and helped him take off his sneakers that he always put on or take off in every show because he knew the routine.
That's fascinating.
Cool.
Yeah, fascinating. again, I see Hank's hand up, but I would like to encourage some people that are new or haven't spoken much yet to Diane.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of take us way back to previous episodes and talk about the fact that there are lots of different kinds of relationships. In your introduction, you alluded to that with those different kinds of loneliness, but I think that's a key kind of idea. Maybe loneliness is not just a single construct. Maybe it's we have needs that are met in different kinds of relationships, and everybody knows that if you've listened to me before that I like the idea of the relational models theory, the more solidary kind of model, the more exchange oriented kind of model, the authority model, and the deservingness model. So I don't think all those models produce loneliness. That is, I don't think people are lonely for authority relationships. They might have another different kind of need that is satisfied by authority, but probably not loneliness. So maybe it's mostly the solidary relationships where people are all obligated to take care of one another.
Yeah, I do think those three types of loneliness are relatively orthogonal to each other. I mean, the example that I would give you is and I'm sure we're all aware of this, there are people that may be well connected to family and friends, but heartbroken due to failures in their romantic life. And you can have acute, I mean, people kill themselves over that type of loneliness.
Yes,
People don't usually kill themselves because they don't get along with their father, but if they're lonely romantically, they might. And so you can be well connected in terms of social loneliness, have friends and family, but if you don't have a life partner, that can be heartbreakingly lonely despite the other connections. Crystal's
Absolutely.
hand went up. Oh, go ahead, Diane. I'm sorry, were you not finished?
But another problem, again, to speak to what some other people were saying, is what mostly in the in group out group kind of context. So as I said at the beginning, I don't think this loneliness is a singular concept.
Right. And the romantic loneliness I just mentioned also makes
Yes,
sense in terms of
that's fine.
evolutionary fitness because it makes you seek a mate, and we know that evolution drives us to survive and reproduce. So,
Absolutely.
Crystal,
Hair bond.
yeah, right. Crystal, welcome and go ahead.
Having me. I know I'm running late from a meeting and really enjoy the conversations that's been happening. I'm also at the heels of trying to do a literature review on the best practices around crisis care. And so when you're discussing about these opportunities, what is that need that people are looking for, especially in the lowest point of their moments? Not much of it is surprising for me, but many of those moments is what I'm hearing from either studies that are saying people just want to know that they've been understood from the other end of the line, that they are seen for those moments. And I think having a conversation with a friend yesterday who she said, I am lonely, even though I have my children with me all the time, running around and I'm doing things. And I think that speaks to that level of loneliness that surfaced in our discussion, because there is such a relatability for many folks to feel like they could be at a party or a social and still not feel connected in the way that they really want to be seen and heard. So when we spoke about Rogers and his ability to be so actively present and listening, that other people felt connected, even if he wasn't looking them in the eyes and he was on a TV screen, there's something about that behavior that I think speaks to the importance of it. That builds that trust for the relationship bit. And I think it speaks a lot to how we are relational beings at the very core of it. And to deny ourselves of that goes into really dangerous paths. As I remember being in the hospital and going on lockdown and seeing folks that had to stay in their room for a week or two as we resolved and cleared up results. And you can tell how much of a big hit it did to many folks. And I think we felt it too, having been in our own spaces, whether it was a short period of time and you got to go out for a walk. But for some of the folks, they didn't get to go for a walk, and how much that hurts and pains people.
Yeah, the lockdown was for most people, I think, was a jolt of loneliness and acute loneliness. My experience was the worst part of it was my inability to hug my grandchildren. I could see them outdoors because they live in my town, 6 feet away, as we all recall. But it actually felt like a physical ache not to be able to give them a hug. And children, the impact of children on loneliness is a double-edged sword. To some degree, children or grandchildren can reduce loneliness. I sent an article out about that with grandparents. On the other hand, I think, we can, there's an old movie called The Diary of a Mad Housewife, if anybody remembers that book and movie, in which a woman, and this is not natural in terms of the way hunter-gatherers lived either, but a suburban housewife locked in a home 24/7 with 2 or 3 children and no adult interaction is going to probably feel very, very lonely despite being around children all the time. Yeah. David and then Hank.
Yeah, so just wanted to follow up on something I believe Diane mentioned, sort of the group level. Of course, anytime you deal with something social, you know about individual and group level adaptations. But I guess in my mind, I was following along with some of the discussions like seeking a mate or seeking just friendship with one other person or a couple other people, that's an individual level adaptation we're talking about. But if you open it up to a group level adaptation, that there are other hypotheses like just having great diversity in a group, and people that feel lonely easily might be more free thinkers or more independent thinkers. You could easily come up with going with this benefits for having a diverse group along that particular axis. I didn't.
Yeah, I just finished reading a book on the influenza epidemic of 1918. I think it was called The Great Influenza, and it's as much about the scientists in the labs as it is about the public health crisis. And one of the things that struck me is that a lot of these brilliant virologists and other types of scientists had little need for human contact and interaction. They were really low on the trait of susceptibility to loneliness. They were kind of really obsessive, and they just wanted to be in the lab doing their work, and their marriages suffered, and they didn't have a lot of friends. Some of them never married, but they made critical scientific advances. So society can benefit, like you're saying, David, society can benefit from people that don't have a high need for connection. We need some of those folks too, maybe.
So is that a group
yeah.
level adaptation then, or okay?
Yeah. Well, I diversity in that trait is beneficial to the group, I guess would be. Yeah. Hank and then Andy and then Kathleen. Hank, Andy, Kathleen.
Okay. I'd like to state this called the myth. I'm making this up as we talk. The myth of high quality attention. Not that it's not a human desire, but what I've seen as a therapist working with individuals, families, couples, and groups, and especially you see it in groups, everybody has a different subjective, let's say there's 8 people in the room, and you want to develop cohesion somehow, if it's possible. But each individual has a different unconscious expectation of what kind of connection is best for them. So I'm calling it a myth because I'm going to call it the wish for a safe quality attention. And those of you who have kids or grandkids or partners, we all have a different version of what it is. Sometimes we don't know what it is. Some people who've been traumatized too much, all they look for is there's a lot of aversion to good quality connection that I've seen, that I've read about, and it's been in the different literatures for a long time, especially in my field. So I'm going to think about safe quality connection that's determined by the people operating together and in the group, and it's going to be different for everybody. But and the other thing is, on an evolutionary level, I don't think we need high quality connection to hang together, to make babies and raise babies. We need good enough quality connection. So there's something about, I don't know where there's high quality. I mean, I've been around it forever, but I think it's a myth. There's a good enough quality of connection for the different individual, couple, group, or collective.
Yeah, it just reminds me, my favorite book ever on parenting was called A Good Enough Parent by Bruno Bettelheim.
Right.
And it talks a little bit about that. The other thing that occurred to me as I listened to you, Hank, is that if you think about going back to the analogy again of hunger or thirst, that loneliness is a hunger that motivates you to sate it in some way. What sates my loneliness may be different than what sates your loneliness. The quantity and quality of connections I may need to feel not lonely could be very different than everybody else on the Zoom. That's very individual.
There's often more misfiring that goes on than people want to imagine.
Yeah.
Maybe I see too much of it because of the field I'm in, but I think you see it in everyday life. There's a lot of misfiring, but we try to get along, so we overlook the misfiring.
Yeah. Perfect connection doesn't exist, so good enough is what you have to content yourself with. I think Kathleen it's an Andy and Kathleen. I'm not very good with keeping track of the order here. Forgive
I
me.
don't have anything to say anymore. It was covered.
Oh, okay, Andy.
Yeah. I think I want to pick up on a couple of things Hank said. For a long time, I have felt that some kinds of attention are higher quality than others. And in fact, I really crave high quality attention. And I think it's certainly true that different people need different kinds of attention, or different kinds of attention can feel high quality to one person or low quality to another. I think that's probably true. But you think about the person who's just self-indulgent braggart who's impatient with everybody else in conversation. That's consistently low quality attention. I'm not sure that serves anybody's real needs. So I would call that objectively low quality, a very low quality conversational style. And there are other conversational styles that I think, like Mr. Rogers, that deliver something deeply important for many. And there's something, and it's not just a matter of subjective preference. I think there's something, I think we can talk about better and worse ways of tending to people in conversation. And I think it's, especially in an age when many people, when we have an epidemic of loneliness, I think it's imperative that we learn how to give people the high quality attention they need. And so I wouldn't want to throw away the concept of high quality attention. Maybe this is where I disagree with Hank, but I certainly agree with his premise that it's important to recognize that the quality of attention you may crave may be different from the kind of attention somebody else might crave.
Well, look, Andy, just if you think about the food imagery and the attention imagery, people in the Holocaust, when they were predisposed to survive, and the Americans and Brits saw these scrawny people and they wanted to feed them, they fed them high quality food. People got sick or died. So they learned, let's give them not high quality, low quality, but what the organism is ready for. And as a therapist, I see it all the time. So my high quality is going to differ from everybody else's, but I wouldn't call it not high quality, but it's going to be very different because of my traits, my environment. But
I think we
so
agree
I
now.
call,
So quality might be a
yeah,
very context sensitive thing.
yeah, sure. Yeah.
Andy, I was going to ask you to repeat that because I wasn't paying much attention to what you said. So
Oh, just that.
no, I'm just kidding. That was a joke. I was not giving you high. I was
High
giving you
quality attention.
low quality attention.
That's right.
Rob,
Artie.
right?
Well, people do
You
zone
got to
out
unmute, Rob. Go ahead, Go ahead, Kathleen. What?
I mean, I took a speech class. I remember the teacher telling us in any kind of situation, people zone out at least 20% of the time. So
And
I
that's
thought
the
you
good
were
news.
sincere. I didn't.
Rob, go ahead if you can unmute. Yep.
Just 20%.
Rob speaks a lot. He knows.
When we decided on this topic of loneliness, I kept thinking about the first line in the Wordsworth poem, "I wandered lonely as a cloud."
Yeah.
And I'm now reading the first stanza, and it strikes me that it might suggest a different way of thinking about it, which is, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So he's talking about having a relationship with a crowd of flowers. Perhaps loneliness is not necessarily being isolated from other people. Perhaps it's being isolated from something in the environment that's meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the modern disconnect from nature, maybe that contributes to a sense of loneliness in some way. I've been fascinated lately by I think this is something that happens more in the UK than in the States, but there's a whole movement in the UK called forest bathing. If
Yep.
anybody's heard that phrase, which sounds to me like just go take a walk in the woods. I mean, that's, but there is something about perhaps our modern tendency to be removed and maybe to some degree alienated from nature. Maybe that does impact loneliness in some fashion, even though it's not about connectedness to people, about connectedness to the natural world. Good point, Rob. Interesting. Yeah, Kathleen.
Nancy Easterlin, who wrote a biocultural interpretation, the biocultural literary interpretation, she uses evolutionary and neuroscience, you know. She would argue, she does argue in one of her chapters that your relationship with people and good attachments are fundamental to having that kind of love for nature, that nature is indifferent to us, but you know that you have to start out with relationships with people and then you can transfer it to place and nature.
We're running up to the hour, and I'm just going to make a final observation, and then we can I think we've already decided what we're doing next month, but you know, whenever we think about any emotion that human beings experience, the evolutionary psychology interpretation of that is that it's in our repertoire because it was adaptive in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And even our quote unquote negative emotions are there for a reason. Just like our negative bodily sensations are there for a reason. There's a reason why it hurts to touch something hot, right? That's adaptive, and our negative emotions are present for reasons as well. So that would be how I would tie this together with other things other emotional topics we've talked about. I think we made a decision last time that next month Diane was going to lead us in a discussion about norms, cultural norms and social cultural norms. Am I giving it the right headline, Diane?
Sounds okay.
Okay.
Is everybody on board with that?
Yeah,
Okay,
Okay.
good enough. And I'm going to be somewhere with possibly unstable internet next month. So if I'm not on board, that means I wasn't able to sign on. And I may toss out a suggestion or two for September on high-low.
Okay, I'm not all that good at posting things on high-low, so
Send them to me. Send them to me. You have my email. Send them to me, and I will. I have your email. I'll email you. Send them to me, and I'll post them for you.
okay, wonderful.
Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Steve.
Go make some good social connections.
Au revoir.
Bye, everyone.
Half a
Bye.
bit.